Thanks. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. This is Ken Saka, CEO and President at Fold & Company. I want to echo Jacob's expression of thanks for folks taking the time today to attend our webinar. What we wanted to do with this event is to provide a kind of a 6-month update. It's hard to believe it's been 6 months already since the end of the scenario planning work we did with the 8 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, which wrapped up, I think, back in February or March of this year. So we've been a little more than 6 months out. And as you guys know, we continue to monitor and look at and examine and explore the healthcare industry, and have found some pretty interesting developments as they relate back to some of the scenario dimensions and scenario themes and strategies that we explored in that project. And so we thought it would be valuable to do a quick 6-month check-in, give you our perspective on what we're seeing in the marketplace, show how it ties back to some of the scenario discussions and themes, and provide some suggestions for what the plans can do to continue to keep the scenario work fresh, use it as a strategy development tool, and some approaches and methods for ongoing vigilance in the marketplace. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jacob. Hopefully we can get the slides up and walk you through it.
So hello again, welcome to the 6-month update. We'll keep this fairly quick. I just wanted to go through some things with you that I think really in retrospect make the work that we did a while ago look pretty interesting in the context of what's happened since then. So we're going to break this talk up into 4 parts. What we're calling the acceleration of consumer-centric healthcare, then interpreting consumerism from a scenario framework perspective, the implications for Blue Cross Blue Shield, and how to manage the evolution of consumer-centric healthcare landscape going forward. So to start off, I'm sure this looks very familiar to all of you. These are the dimensions that we developed upon which to build the scenarios that we strategized out last December. Now you remember that the creation of these dimensions was part of a fairly long, structured, and somewhat arduous process. We had a workshop in which we developed collaboratively a lot of drivers. We validated those drivers through a survey of the larger working group, and then in collaboration with all 8 plans, we synthesized the drivers into these 4 dimensions. And what we're going to see as we go through this deck is that, while these dimensions played a very specific role in the process of building out the scenarios that we used last December, they have a somewhat different kind of usefulness going forward. And we'll see that, I believe, pretty much right away in this next slide, where we're basically pointing to what we see as a really interesting trend that's beginning to occur in healthcare. There's been a lot of lip service in the healthcare industry to the idea of consumerism or consumer-centric healthcare, but the reality is that the experience of interacting with the healthcare system is largely unchanged for most people, and it seems like for things to really change, consumers have to participate in healthcare in a proactive way that they haven't had the chance to do heretofore. And the way they're doing this is perhaps not exactly directly, but through very highly aligned organizations that are serving as proxies for them. And we're saying that right now those proxies fall into 2 groups: employers and what we're calling right now admired consumer brands. As for employers, some of these have been very much in the news. The Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan Chase Troika has been talked about quite a bit, and Atul Gawande has said that the focus is going to be on providing first-class healthcare for employees. The same kind of thing has come out of Tesla. There are a number of companies that are working to provide healthcare directly for their employees, as opposed to just being, as opposed to the employer just being somewhat of an agent, albeit a subsidizing agent of healthcare coverage. Now, the way that employers are aligned with their employees is pretty obvious. The alignment between consumer brands and consumers is maybe a little bit more subtle, but we're going to get into that in more detail in a later slide. So bear with me on that for now. But anyway, when we have these two proxies converging directly into the healthcare space as a proactive player, they are in a way serving the consumer's interests in a way that has not been done before, with basically two direct and very closely related results. One is that the healthcare consumer experience improves, and that improvement comes primarily from making it less inconvenient. We're taking the pain out of seeing a doctor by making it a more convenient experience, and as making use of healthcare resources becomes less inconvenient, engagement increases. And as healthcare engagement increases, the value increases in terms of superior outcomes. So, our thesis here is that vertical integration with the right non-traditional players enfranchises consumers in new ways and drives value. And this raises the obvious question of how will standalone payer organizations compete? And before we move on to the next slide, I want to point something out here. And if you think about it, these two results of this convergence, the improvement of the consumer experience and value, it really touches on all of the dimensions that we put together collectively last year. And I think it's worth calling that out. Kudos to everyone listening. We came up with the right dimensions, and I'll get more into depth in that as we go forward.
And everybody, as we continue to go through this, the control panel for the webinar has a chat function. If there are any questions that anybody would like to pose or any comments, please either use that chat function. I think all the attendees are automatically muted by the webinar platform. So if you do have a question or would like Jacob or I to go deeper on anything, please just use that chat functionality and we'll be sure to address those questions and comments.
Thanks, Ken. So want to go back just a little bit to before we had the scenario planning workshops and look at the way that the healthcare industry has tried to adapt to ACA. And I look at this adaptation as having taken place in two stages or two iterations. Interestingly, our workshop came about right at the juncture point between these two iterations. But the first iteration was basically attempts at horizontal integration. We saw traditional players trying to merge in order to have greater bargaining position against providers. There was this sentiment that the market was going to be made very unstable by ACA, and the way to survive it or possibly thrive in it was to become big. So Anthem announced an agreement to acquire Cigna in June of 2015. A month later, Aetna announced that they were going to buy Humana. As it turned out, neither one of these horizontal mergers panned out. The Department of Justice had issues with both with regards to antitrust issues, and things did not pan out in this first iteration. It's interesting that in this first iteration, the players, these payer organizations, were, I'd like to think that they were applying kind of old thinking to a new world. And the thought was, this is the way we'll do it. We'll circle the wagons, be big, achieve scale. They were prevented from doing that. Now, I have in here a chart showing the performance of healthcare-related stocks, the S&P Healthcare Index versus the general market over the years since ACA has passed. And as you can see, they've actually done better than the broader market. And I'm just including that to kind of illustrate how the old thinking was really just not adept at capturing what the reality of the situation was. ACA was not the threat that everyone thought it would be, because what happened was payers gained millions of federally subsidized members, both through the exchanges as well as the expansion of Medicaid. Going forward, going forward, the second iteration of the adaptation to the AC world began to happen, and this was when convergence started, when non-traditional healthcare organizations merged into, or attempting to merge into, the healthcare space. Interestingly, this started to happen right around the time that we all started working on this project together. You've all heard of all of these deals. I don't need to go through them in any detail. Just to point out that while Cigna's acquisition of eScripts and United Health's Optum's acquisition of providers, they're still staying within the traditional healthcare space. One thing that this convergence has made clear is that it's basically leading to the default extinction of the standalone payer as a business model at the national level. So moving on, interpreting consumerism from a scenario framework perspective. This is where things get interesting with regards to the work that we did earlier. Returning to our dimensions that we put together from the workshop, we use these dimensions in a constructive purpose in December and the time leading up to that to help us make these scenarios. They kind of served as the skeletal bones on which the flesh of the fictional scenarios were built, and as such, they served as a kind of a static structure for us to build these future scenarios on. What we've seen 6 months out, looking at these dimensions, is that they move, and they move in ways that affect the other dimensions. It's not so much that they move in concert, but rather there are these kind of multi-causal relationships between the various dimensions. They all seem to kind of act upon each other. I think the ways some of these layers, these influences, I think are pretty intuitive. The way that the pursuit of alignment would have an impact on access, the way innovation would have an impact on access, and how alignment would affect innovation. The other thing is, I think that this may be a little bit less intuitive, but I think we're seeing all of this have an impact on the societal view as well. The kind of the main takeaway from this, well, there are two main takeaways. One is that this convergence that we're seeing, this is causing behavioral changes in all of the scenario dimensions. This is a very huge disruptive trend in healthcare. And I think the fact that it's acting on all of these dimensions is a strong indication of that. It also, again, points to the relevance of the dimensions as we came up with them through our process. The other thing, though, the other takeaway from this is that, if it's the case that we can see causal relationships in terms of the directions of these dimensions between each other, in other words, if we see alignment moving in a certain way, we believe that that's going to have an impact on access. It gives us a richer context for thinking about the deployment of contingent strategies. We've talked about contingent strategies earlier as we were concluding the workshop in terms of looking for markers for specific dimensions, but it seems like we can actually add other dimensions and kind of multi-layer the ways that we would think about contingency strategy deployment. So, so this is something that, I don't think we would have really understood this 6 months ago. We've had a chance to road test this, and, we think it's very interesting. We think that the work that we did before is giving us a way to look at things, and it may not be, it's not the only way. I mean, there are a number of different perspectives from which one could look at this that would help one to kind of understand it, but we've definitely put one of those together. We've put together kind of a vision paradigm through which, or a lens through which to look at these things, which can make these developments something that we can make sense of. Going back to the innovative non-traditional players who are coming into this. Again, it's employers and retailers. These are not players who are seeking the status quo, and that's another reason that this is going to be disruptive. And the fact of the matter is that the incumbent players, largely, including payers, they have a lot invested in the status quo. The status quo is doing quite well with them, as we showed in that stock chart. The ones who are going to come in and disrupt healthcare are not the ones who have a vested interest in keeping things as they are, obviously, but it's the ones who have the most to gain, who clearly have the most to gain. And in the case of employers, the alignment there is pretty obvious. The ones who have the most to gain being, consumers of healthcare. They want to be healthy. The alignment between employers and the consumers is pretty clear. Happy, healthy workers are productive, and then given what an expense healthcare is for corporations, it's generally the number 2 non-productive expense after compensation. It's very obvious what the tie-ins for employers here are. Some very headline companies are involved in providing healthcare directly for their employees. And as we look at this disruption, one thing that we see is that providers are well positioned for this convergence, because you're never going to disintermediate the doctors out of healthcare. Their roles will evolve, and to a certain extent, the scope of what they do may be reduced through the use of technologies, such as artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, they're always going to be doctors. And some major medical providers are beginning to aggressively work directly with employers. And if you look for innovation in how employers are addressing healthcare for their employees, you don't see much about them working with payer organizations. It's really employers working directly with providers, if not developing their own provider site and infrastructure for their employees. And make no mistake about it, the intention here on the part of the providers, the name brand providers, is to disintermediate the payer organization, which at the end of the day is a third-party profit-seeking organization. The providers want to disintermediate payers out of that picture. Now, how are employers different from? How are employer providers different from the traditional employer as a kind of an agent for their employees to access healthcare coverage, albeit a subsidizing agent? Again, a lot of these are very obvious, but just a couple here that I want to call out. The first one, selling direct to the customer. If the employer has this kind of vested interest in the healthcare of their employees, if they're making this kind of investment, they're not just an agent. They're not a connector between or an enabler between the payer organization and the employee, but they are representing the ultimate consumer, the employee, as a direct proxy. So services are being sold directly to the customer. You no longer have this kind of confusing third party where the consumer is not actually the one who's paying for the services. Another thing to point out here is behavioral levers. To the extent that we're looking at healthcare in this context as a long-term value proposition, everyone understands that behavioral health is of critical importance. It's the tip of that spear, and employers have more effective levers for affecting that than other parties do. And then the other thing I think worth pointing out here is the freedom from fee for services. One of the obstacles to the embracing of bundled payments or going further, real population health management, is that a lot of companies, the financial functions, they may not exactly like fee for services. However, at least they can see where the dollars are going. And that has been an obstacle for a more holistic approach to healthcare compensation. But with the investment that employers would make within this paradigm, they're going to be pursuing value. And so that liberates one from fee for services. I'm going to go to the next slide. So now going back to the admired consumer brand aspect of this. By admired consumer brands, what we mean are brands that, they know how to win customers. They know how to keep them. They know how to build successful relationships with consumers, and they do this in an environment of competition, which traditional payers and providers are not used to. And in that way, they represent the interests of consumers in the sense that they know what those interests are and they know how to serve them. And they will be attracted into the healthcare space because of the inefficiencies that exist here. They see themselves as players who can come in, correct those inefficiencies, and generate financial gains through doing so. And right now, what we're seeing are retailers doing this, with CVS and Walmart being the most obvious examples. The next wave may very well be technology companies. Obviously, these are very admired brands as well, Google, Apple, and millennials are very used to being able to engage through mobile devices. So I think we'll probably be seeing another wave of this kind of convergence, meaningful convergence from technology companies, and we all know that they've made the investments. So this is going to happen. So anyway, I have a case study here of how a consumer company can converge into healthcare and drive value, basically. And this great example is the CVS Performance Pharmacy Network. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's not something that CVS has been really pushing out to the media. But basically, this is a program in which retail pharmacies that work with CVS Caremark PBM are being rewarded for helping patients with chronic conditions, their customers with chronic conditions, maintain their medication regimes. CVS has not announced exactly how they do the analysis or what form the incentive takes, but it looks like it would be a discount on drugs purchased through the Caremark PBM for these pharmacies. And the pharmacies are not limited to CVS. It's a network of about 30,000 locations, CVS and Walgreens locations making up the majority of them, but about 10,000 or so of these locations are actually independent pharmacies that are customers of Caremark. Now, what happens by doing this by having pharmacists and pharmacy technicians play a more proactive role in helping customers with chronic conditions maintain their medication regimes, you're taking an aspect of primary care and you're moving it out of an expensive traditional care venue into a retail venue. So you're taking costs out of the equation by doing that. Then the other thing is by addressing issues related to chronic conditions, which is where there's an extremely high cost concentration, you're addressing that. You're hitting the sweet spot of cost savings. So this strategy of CVS's, it hits the value ratio at both the denominator and the numerator. So it's bringing about an efficiency that can be, if well executed, could be very, very effective. And it's interesting that it takes, a retail pharmacy to do something that payers and providers haven't been able to do. Getting patients with chronic conditions to maintain their medications, taking them the way they should. That's always been an issue. Primary care providers have not been able to effectively address it. Part of that reason is it's just not as convenient to see your primary care physician with the kind of regularity that you're going to see a pharmacist at your local CVS or whatever. So this plays to or addresses the convenience factor, making accessing meaningful healthcare less inconvenient, therefore less painful, more likely to happen, a higher level of engagement, higher value. And then the other thing that happens, which isn't necessarily part of the healthcare picture per se, but the company itself gets cascading benefits of integration. In the case of CVS, the Aetna payer arm of the organization will have reduced medical losses. And the retail arm, the CVS retail infrastructure, is getting people into their retail environment. So there are synergies that can take place across these different kinds of business models within this integrated healthcare company. So we're ending up with a picture that looks like there's several kinds of healthcare ecosphere that can emerge from this, or several that we're kind of seeing emerge. And the way I've laid it out on this slide, I'm kind of positioning the CVS Aetna model on one extreme as a kind of very open model, easy to access, not necessarily exclusive to members of Aetna. It's basically consumers, and not just CVS consumers that go into CVS and Walgreens stores and independent pharmacies can benefit from this. The PBM in this picture, of course, be Caremark, and the routine care venue will be retail locations, CVS and Target for now. Maybe it would be others. And then for primary, urgent, and acute care, the role that the providers would play within this space would probably be largely the same. It would just be somewhat ameliorated by more care taking place outside of the high-cost venue. The Walmart Humana model, should it ever come about, would be very similar, but perhaps a little bit more insular in the sense that Walmart, which has been working with Humana for a number of years, they're very concentrated on Humana's core Medicare Advantage business. And so here you would be addressing not just consumers generally, but a particular demographic. The PBM would be Humana RX, and routine care venue would be Walmart. And again, doctors would play very much the same kind of role. And then at the other end, you have what may be the Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan model, in which you have a very robust but also very self-contained healthcare ecosphere, in which Those fortunate enough to be employed in these organizations where employee healthcare is taken very seriously with an eye to not only quality but patient experience, because that leads to quality. You'll be very fortunate in enjoying these kinds of benefits, but people outside of this sphere will be kind of to some degree left out in the cold. And this is the interesting thing about the way this looks here is that if we think of this as kind of the grid upon which future healthcare models will develop, and things really do seem to be moving in this way. The one thing that we don't see plugging into this is geography. These players are all at a national level, and they will get their strength through scale and managing these resources, and their customers over, in scale across territories, across states and regions. And so this brings up the question of again, not only how does a standalone payer organization thrive in this kind of environment, but what happens to the geographic, to the advantages of a regional focus? Does this kind of future of healthcare mitigate any advantage that comes out of that? So moving on to the implications for Blue Cross Blue Shield, I want to put this back into the context of our scenario planning workshop. If you think about it, the paradigm that I've laid out fits very nicely into two of the 5 scenarios that we came out with in December. We see this future as being a bit have and have-nots, and for those of you who remember, have and have-nots is a world in which there is there is a privileged class of employees at companies where they have health benefits and they're very well cared for, and everyone else is kind of hustling to take care of themselves, with there being an infrastructure of kind of a lower cost, second tier, easily accessible healthcare infrastructure out there. In the case of the Amazon Prime, there's more of a collective approach. There's still a tiered approach, but people aren't necessarily left out in the cold. It's still very graduated in the way healthcare is applied, but it's a little bit more open and a little bit less insular than have and have-nots. But we see things going in both directions. But even the players, Amazon Prime, Berkshire Hathaway, and JP Morgan being maybe the prime example, even to the extent that they are fundamentally focused on providing healthcare for their employees, they're not going to stay insular, not the way we see it, because to really pursue efficiencies, they're going to have to rationalize supply and demand over a large scale. And think about it, if Amazon is the one that's the paradigm for the more insular model, who really thinks that Amazon's ambition here is limited to servicing their own employees? It doesn't seem very likely. But what we see happening is there being the emergence of some kind of healthcare platform that is able to match demand with supply in a way that creates efficiencies and balances out need and capacity. A real banal example of something like this would be there's an MRI somewhere that is underutilized, and someone gets a diagnosis from a primary physician that they need an MRI. Well, they go into this Amazon-like platform and find out that the imaging can be done at this particular MRI facility at half the usual rate if the appointment is booked for such and such a time. This is something that we think is not just a realistic model going forward, but inevitable. And there are just so many examples of businesses transforming from something more traditional to basically a platform. Think about Uber, versus Yellow Cab. Think about Amazon versus Borders. Think about hotels versus Airbnb. The emergence of platforms is it's happening across a variety of industries, and we think it's inevitable here as well. And this clearly validates the core strategies that we came out with back in December of servicing as a connector, which is what this is, making healthcare smarter, which obviously the analytics that could be generated from this kind of platform would help to do, and seeking out opportunities for alignment among the Blues. And there may be obstacles to that, practical and political obstacles to the full pursuit of alignment, but to an extent, the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans are going to have to change their thinking and figure out a way to get past those obstacles to address this new world to whatever extent. So this is how we see things developing, and we think it's pretty interesting to look at them in terms of the work we've done 6 months ago. I think it shows the relevance of what we've done and how it can continue to be relevant as we look at things through this particular lens. So going on to the next section. Ken, are you going to take over here?
Yeah, I can pick it up here, Jake. So first of all, thanks, Jake. That was a tremendous and I think really insightful set of commentary, kind of putting into perspective what you've been seeing, what we've been seeing in the industry in the past 6 months, and as you said, really reinforcing the scenario dimensions and some of the core strategies that came out of that work. So it's good to see that we have hopefully, I think, put together a reasonable framework with those 4 dimensions and their dichotomous behaviors to evaluate and interpret and sort of keep our arms around the high degree of uncertainty and volatility that continues to exist in the industry. With that in mind, if you guys want to press down to the next slide, I just wanted to kind of reiterate the point that we've made with a number of plans in the aftermath of the scenario work about the importance of finding a way to keep a continuous and ongoing vigilance on some of these market developments, and to remind everybody of the benefit, I think, of the frameworks and the structure that we developed in the scenario work as a means to interpret that in a way that kind of separates the signals from the noise, that really enables the plans and your strategy development functions and your executive management teams to be cognizant of the important stuff that's happening and to have a frame by which to interpret it, think about the implications for any individual plan or for the collective set of plans, and tie it back to some of the strategy outputs both on the core and the contingent side that came out of our work earlier this year. One way to do that is some type of continuous strategic early warning system or function or process. We've set the 4 dimensions up in such a way that you can evaluate the impact of the behaviors across any one of the 4 dimensions almost as a dashboard, as an analog dial. What you see here on the left-hand side of this slide is where we feel the dials are pointing at this point in time in terms of alignment of risk and care, given a lot of what Jacob covered here, maybe on the accelerating side of things where that alignment has started to come into focus, perhaps in a way somewhat disruptive to incumbent players, but nonetheless, that alignment seems to be happening more so than being stifled. Societal view of healthcare, sort of in the middle, but maybe leaning a bit right now toward the individual side, given some of the changes in the Affordable Care Act, some of the emergence of new high deductible skinny healthcare plans and networks, and a few other developments. Access to care, still somewhat, in our opinion, challenged, although perhaps that needle is starting to trend toward the left, given some of what Jake talked about. And innovation, still somewhat stifled in terms of addressing some of the broader challenges, not just technologically, but from a business model innovation point of view that continues to hinder the overall system. And this type of monitoring, given the framework that we've built, sets the stage and provides the ability for there to be, I'm sorry guys, yeah, it sets the stage for the ability to have your decision makers and strategists working off a common set of judgments and perspectives and assessments of what's going on in the external environment. It provides the basis to do some gaming of trend evolution and market response, given some of these new disruptive players that we think will continue to enter. What might they do to upset and disrupt things? What might response options be for any of the plans? And how might the competition respond as well? This sets the stage to be able to game some of that out. And ultimately helps generate different strategy options, re-examine some of the contingent strategies that came out of the scenario work, and help with some degree of risk assessment around any option that a plan might consider, whether it's related to the contingent strategies, the core strategies, or some new strategic thinking that we didn't cover in the scenario work. So in our opinion, this basis of ongoing vigilance and monitoring and assessment is an important base of the pyramid for this type of more advanced strategic thinking to occur. One thing you'll see in the webinar panel, there's a handout that we've provided that is an early warning toolkit that provides some framework and template and methodology to be able to do this sort of monitoring. So I'd encourage you guys to grab that, download it, take a look at it, and potentially employ it in your organizations. And then if we can just go to that next slide, what we can do with some of this vigilance is to think about ways to introduce additional structured frameworks and ways to think about disruptive events and tie those back to strategy. Two ways that we frequently do that with a number of our clients is on the left-hand side, a very simple SWOT analysis. We touched on some SWOT type work in the second workshop back in December. It's a very core methodology that's at the heart of a lot of Fulden Company wargaming, strategy workshops, scenario planning, as you guys have already seen. Very good, tried and true technique. But a second one that maybe is a little less popular, is what we call a strategic horizons analysis that essentially segregates or segments where you've got opportunities to maintain in the near term a favorable or optimal competitive positioning, but also lets you explore derivative platform products, such as that notion of being a connector or providing a platform or a marketplace for this new class of participants who are entering the market. And then at the outskirts, real breakthrough or new categories or new product innovation, and really help determine the extent to which the external environment is shifting or changing that would lead an organization to want to focus on either maintenance, derivative products, or breakthrough type innovation. And this framework is a nice way to do that. So wanted to mention those and give you some exposure to those. Fulden Company is certainly available and eager to help out in any way we can, but really just want to emphasize the importance of the continuous monitoring and vigilance and the tie back of some of these judgments that represented by what Jacob walked us through, back to your own internal thinking and strategy analysis. So with that, let me stop there. If we'll leave the line open for a couple more minutes if there are any questions that anybody wants to communicate via the chat or the questioning function. We've recorded the webinar, and we'll make that recording available to all of you to share with any of your colleagues who weren't able to join us today, and we'll share with some of the other 8 plans who were unable to attend today's webinar as well. But let me pause there. We'll wait a couple of minutes in case any questions come out. And if not, again, just want to thank everybody for their time and their attendance today, and certainly feel free to reach out to either Jacob or myself with any follow-on questions or any areas that we could potentially provide some assistance on.